Evening and welcome to our seventh lockdown learning session. My name is Bren Carlisle and I am the Director of Public Affairs at the Zionist Federation of Australia. Tonight I am delighted to have as our guest speaker Yossi Klein-Halevi. Yossi is a Senior Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. Together with Imam Abdullah Antepli of Duke University, he co-directs the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative, which teaches emerging young Muslim American leaders about Judaism, Jewish identity, and Israel. Yossi's 2013 book, Like Dreamers, followed the lives of veterans of the paratrooper brigade that won for Israel the Kotel in the Six-Day War. It's a fascinating history, not just of their lives, but also of post-1967 Israeli society. His latest book is Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, a New York Times bestseller, and a book I read a couple of months ago. The book is a series of letters that Yossi writes to an unknown Palestinian neighbor across the valley from his Jerusalem apartment. It seeks to bridge the yawning gap between Israeli and Palestinian narratives and is written as much for Jews as it is for Arabs. That Yossi is a brilliant writer is reflected in the fact he also writes opinion pieces for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And as I think we'll all learn tonight, Yossi has thought long and hard about his own and collective Jewish identity, interfaith relations, and the power and importance of Israel as a symbol for the world's Jews. Yossi will be in conversation this evening with Jeremy Leibler, the president of the ZFA. Before I hand you over to Jeremy, just a quick reminder that next week we'll be speaking with the spokesperson for the Israel Embassy in Canberra, Eman Amasha. We will send you details about that event in the next few days. However, with no further ado, I'll hand you over to Jeremy.
Thank you, Bren. And Yossi, thank you so much for joining us. I think it was a year and a half ago, or just over a year ago, when we had dinner in Jerusalem, and I reached out to you really because I'd read your books. I'd really enjoyed them, and there was a lot, I really could identify with. And ever since then, I've been desperately trying to get you here, and you're still on my list, and we will do it. But this is the next best thing for now in the times in which we live. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jeremy.
So Yossi, maybe before we, primarily we want to talk tonight about your book, your latest book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. But before we start there, I've read all of your books and your memoir, which was, written quite early on, but has probably received a lot more prominence after some of your subsequent books, I imagine. It's really quite fascinating, and it's your life story, of course, and it struck a chord with me. I mean, you grew up in a house with a father who was a Holocaust survivor. You probably know that in Australia we have the per capita the highest proportion of Holocaust survivors outside of Israel, and certainly the Holocaust has had a profound impact on how the Jewish community in Australia has evolved. Before we get into your latest book, can you tell us a little bit about how you grew up? Some of the interesting things you got involved with, and then we can maybe come back later on and talk about how that played a role in your worldview today.
Right. Well, first of all, Jeremy, it's really good to be back with you, and thank you for bringing me to Australia in whatever form. I was in Australia in 2013, and it was just a fantastic experience. I have a brother-in-law in Tasmania, so I would love to take you up on a return visit sometime.
Great.
So my upbringing, in some sense, interestingly enough, really brings me in very close proximity to the Australian Jewish community. I grew up in the far reaches of Brooklyn, in a neighborhood called Borough Park, which has been in the news lately. It's one of the largest ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods, and it's been particularly hard hit by the pandemic. And when I was growing up, there was we were recovering from another kind of pandemic, and this was the largest concentration of Holocaust survivors in America. That was Borough Park. So for me, growing up in a survivor home with a father who spoke nonstop about the war, which was, of course, very unusual, and second generation will appreciate how unusual that was. My father insisted on on raising me as a kind of a surrogate contemporary of his. And he wanted me to have the consciousness of a survivor. He was desperately afraid that I would grow up to become what he called a stupid American. And a stupid American was someone who didn't understand survival, didn't understand threat, and would be, in some sense, emotionally, psychologically defenseless. And so for me, the initial lesson of the Shoah, the overriding lesson, the only lesson that mattered was Jewish self-protection. And as a result of that, I naturally gravitated to the right. I grew up in the Beitar youth movement, which was the right wing of the Zionist youth movements. And then I gravitated to Meir Kahane and the Jewish Defense Group, and the Soviet Jewry movement, of course. And eventually, just to make a very long and torturous story short, I came to realize that I actually was not my father's contemporary, that the distance between my generation's experience and my father's could have really been measured by centuries and not mere decades. I grew up in America in the most successful and prosperous and safe diaspora in Jewish history, with a Jewish state as an option. And so today I hold two citizenships. I have an Israeli passport and an American passport. And those are really in some ways the fulfillment of the Jewish dream, Jewish fantasy of millennia to experience safety or relative safety, or at least the ability to defend ourselves, which is how I would define Zionism. And so I came to realize that I actually don't belong psychologically in the 30s and 40s, very much in the aftermath. And that imposes a whole different set of responsibilities, which is how do we maintain the gift of Jewish power that we've inherited from the generation of the survivors? And at the same time, how do we balance that by finding our place in a very complicated world and with very complicated moral responsibility?
That's really interesting. And maybe we'll come back to this once we've spoken a little bit about letters to my Palestinian neighbor. But, you know, I think it's worth exploring the extent to which you would have been able to do what you did with that book had you not had the benefit of, you know, sort of that experience growing up and seeing and really deeply understanding the psychology of that part of the Jewish world.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, too often today, you know, we're talking across each other without a real understanding of where, even within the Jewish world, forget Palestinians for a moment, you know, where the other is coming from. But moving on to letters, maybe let's just start off. I think a lot of the audience would have read it, but for those that haven't, tell us a little bit about it and why you decided to sit down one day and, you know, look out your balcony and write a letter to your, you know, your Palestinian neighbor who you'd never met.
So I live in a neighborhood called French Hill, which is the very edge of Jerusalem, and I live literally in the last row of houses in French Hill. Outside of my porch from where I'm sitting now is the separation wall, the security barrier. And on the next hill, within very clear visual distance, are Palestinian villages. And the book was really born through insomnia. I would be sitting in my study late at night, looking out at the very complicated view across the way, hearing the muezzin, the call to prayer, as if it were happening in my living room. And I would have these conversations in my head with my Palestinian neighbor about who I am, who the Jewish people are, why we came home, everything that I wish our neighbors understood about us. And so one night I just began writing, literally sitting down and writing longhand as if I were writing a letter. Dear neighbor, I know nothing about you. I see the lights of your home. You know nothing about me. You see the lights of my home. And I feel that we live in such intimacy, we could almost hear each other breathe. But I would like to tell you something about why I am your neighbor, why I live here, why I left my home in New York City in 1982, why my neighbors, my Jewish neighbors, left their homes in Kurdistan and Morocco and Russia and Ethiopia, why we're here, why we came home, why we believe this is home. And so I wrote a book about Zionism for Palestinians. And it occurred to me as I was writing this book that we have been in a 100-year conflict with Palestinians, with much of the Arab world. And no writer on our side ever thought of turning to the Arab world and saying, this is our story, this is who we are. Because what they get in their media and schools and mosques is an inversion, a perversion of who we are, of what our story is. And why not tell our story? And so I wrote this book. I had it translated into Arabic, offered it for free downloading in Arabic, and invited my neighbors to respond. Now, at the same time, I very much had in mind that I was writing a book that other people would read, hopefully young Jews would read. And this was an attempt to invite others to eavesdrop into my conversation with my Palestinian neighbor and tell our story not only to Palestinians, and I had no idea, of course, what they would do with this book, but to also tell the story to ourselves, because I felt an acute need to write a book that would be short, that could speak to a younger generation of Jews and give ourselves a coherent 21st century feminist narrative.
Yeah. So I want to come back to the last point you just made about also speaking to Jews, because what struck me when I read the book, was that this could equally be called Letter to My Diaspora Jewish Family. And in fact, it's a critical book for diaspora Jews to read. But let's come back to that a little bit later. When I read the book, it was a bit of a roller coaster of emotions. It really, I think it sort of took hold of me in all sorts of ways. On the one hand, there's this sort of sense of pride from the way in which you managed to tell the Jewish story in such a powerful and meaningful way. And I took pride in that as a Jew and as a Zionist. And then the sort of pride, was followed by a sense of anxiety as you sort of explored the imperfections of that Jewish story. And those are imperfections that anyone that reads and lives in the world is aware of, but when you see it in paper written by someone who very much comes from your world and your story, it can be confronting. And then the anxiety is sort of followed by relief, because you then go on to contextualize those imperfections in a way that doesn't sort of paint over them, but gives context to the audience to understand, well, why and how and when. It doesn't make it all okay, but it explains it. And the combination of all those three things, you actually feel like you've gone through this emotional roller coaster. And it struck me that you've got this capacity to articulate the Jewish story with pride yourself, yet still accept that there are other narratives out there. And you don't feel the need to attack those narratives, even where you identify that you don't agree with them, or that even on a factual level, you disagree with them. So my question is, I want to hear, really interested to hear what are the sort of reactions you got, maybe starting off before we get to the Palestinian reaction, actually in the Jewish world. Mm-hmm. But also, do you think that this is scalable? Because when I read this book, I just think, and we're not trying, where are the other Yossis? Where are the others? Do we have a critical mass? Are we able to build, maybe in the next generation, this generation of younger Jews in Israel and outside, a generation of Jews who can engage who are able to engage in a nuanced way with our story, warts and all.
So I so much appreciate what the way that you've responded to this book, because one of my goals in writing this was to try to give diaspora Jews something of the Israeli perspective that I learned as an immigrant here. Had I remained an American Jew, I could never have written this book. What Israel gave me was the self-confidence to tell our story without squeamishness, and to tell our story in all of its complexity, because I have that deep belief that this is a good story. This is an extraordinary story. And I'm not afraid of its imperfections. I live with its imperfections every day. That's the experience of Israel. And one of the differences in becoming an Israeli, as opposed to being a diaspora Jew, is that you learn that to live Israel in its fullness, without anxiety, without apology. Who we are. This is our story, and Israelis, we love our story. We will defend our story literally to the death if we have to. But we also know that we don't need to defend every aspect of our story. And so there's something in the experience of Jewish power, of sovereignty, that is psychologically empowering. And I wanted to impart something of that to diaspora Jews. And there was also the sense that I have increasingly felt. I spend a good deal of time on the lecture circuit, primarily among American Jews. And what I have increasingly felt was the need for diaspora Jews to have a 21st century language of Israel. And by that I mean a language in which we own up to our imperfections without the anxiety that we're going to lose the legitimacy of our story. How do we combine a sense of empathy with the Palestinians, a sense of acknowledgement of the Palestinian tragedy, the shattering of a people, without sacrificing the integrity of our story? Now, to acknowledge my neighbor's suffering and tragedy doesn't diminish the justness of my story. And so what I was trying to do in this book was, in a sense, model what a Zionist conversation on the Palestinian issue might sound like, that on the one hand has moral coherence, and on the other hand doesn't undermine the historical legitimacy of our struggle and what we've achieved here. And you asked, Jeremy, if this is scalable. I'll tell you one story, a response from one young American Jew, a student at a university in the Midwest. And she sent me an article that she published in her campus paper, an open letter to a BDS activist. Dear BDS activist, I'm choosing this form of writing to you directly because I just read a book by an Israeli who wrote a series of letters about Zionism to his Palestinian neighbor. And if he can reach out to his Palestinian neighbor, I can reach out to you. You and I share a deep commitment to social justice, but here's what I feel you need to understand about Israel and Zionism. And I read that and I felt, Dayenu. This book gave an embattled student on a liberal American campus the backbone and the tools to go on the offensive. Because what I fear about our response to BDS and the assault against Israel is we're always in defensive mode. We're always waiting for the next blow, and then we're going to figure out, how do we push back? And what I tried to do in this book is go on the offensive. I'm going to take Zionism into Arabic. I'm going to take it to the Palestinian side. Now argue with me. Come back at me. Write me your narrative. And I invite Palestinians and people throughout the Arab world to respond to this book. And they are responding.
Yeah, so it's interesting, and maybe that's a good entree to talk about the Palestinian response. I want to come back a little bit later to diaspora jewelry, but I read more recently because it only came out in your second iteration. So just for those watching, the hardback of the book is the first version, and then the softback has 50 pages of responses from Palestinians who responded to Yossi's letters, and it's confronting. Some of those letters is confronting reading. Did you overall, stepping back, did you feel more or less hopeful after reading those letters?
I have to tell you in all honesty that the question of hope didn't really enter. Do I believe that there is a chance for peace between Israel and the Palestinian national movement? Not anytime soon. Did the willingness of some Palestinians to engage with me, to debate with me, tell me where they agree, where they disagree, was that encouraging? It was encouraging in the sense that my hope was to find a few people, and I wasn't looking for any greater numbers than that, a few people on the Palestinian side with whom we could model a possible Palestinian-Israeli conversation over competing narratives. A conversation that would be passionate. We disagree passionately over what happened in 1948 and why, what happened in 1967, who's responsible for the collapse of the Oslo process. And we will never, in all likelihood, agree on those fundamental issues. But are there Palestinians willing to engage me on the basic premise that this is a tragic conflict between two indigenous peoples, each of whom has a right to be in this land? I found those partners. Some of them have come with me publicly. I did a tour of American campuses with one of the Palestinian letter writers. I made a film with another of the respondents. And so I wasn't looking for hope. I was looking for a way of creating a new language and a new model for speaking about these issues, and then releasing it and seeing what happens. So, Jeremy, I would say that I really had two goals here. The first goal was to create a 21st century Zionist language that might be useful for us in speaking about our story with Palestinians or even with ourselves. And the second goal was to create a language that Palestinians and Israelis could speak among ourselves about how do we disagree without turning our conversation into a take no prisoners duel to the death. And I've been in so many of those debates over the years. I'm a veteran of the op-ed wars, the Israeli-Palestinian wars. And I did that for 25 years. And I needed to find a different way of speaking about these issues, if only to keep myself interested, keep myself engaged. And a writer's responsibility is to create language. And so what I tried to do in this book is to create a language that might, first of all, take myself by surprise. Someone who's been so immersed in these issues. Here's a different way of speaking about issues that we all know so well.
Well, I think you certainly achieved that. And I think beyond that, I mean, for me reading it, I felt it almost gave me a sense of confidence, because it was, I think this would apply to many people reading it. It's a reminder that the centre still exists. It is somewhere, and maybe I'm not as gifted. I wouldn't be able to articulate it in the way you have, but you did it for me, and I'm sure many others, in a way that said it's okay to have empathy, yet still for others, and accept that there is an imperfect situation, yet still have pride and confidence in your own story and where you come from and your narrative, and that these two worlds can sort of live together. And, onto the sort of Israel diaspora relations, which is a subject that occupies a lot of my time and a lot of my thinking time, because, in Australia, we're a different community to the United States. And I would say the relationship isn't as stressed today between Australian Jews and Israel as it is in some parts of the American Jewish community, but we certainly still, notwithstanding that, we face similar challenges. And some of the quotes, and I jotted them down from the book because it's unique for an individual who is writing a book, really reaching out to your Palestinian neighbors, a willingness to accept that there are legitimate alternative narratives to this story, even if they conflict with ours. And then there are quotes like this, and I'll read them out because they're powerful and I think really important. You say, "I dread inflicting a self-imposed wound on the Jewish people. How do we abandon Hebron without doing violence to our most basic sense of Jewish history?" And then you say, "Much of the Israeli left has committed the fatal mistake of emotionally withdrawing from Judea and Samaria." And you say, "I'm deeply moved by the success of the settlement movement. The re-emergence of native Judeans and Samaritans, children and now grandchildren, have been born and raised in the rebuilt Jewish communities of Shiloh, Ofra, Beit El, and Kiryat Arba." And I think hearing that and sort of seeing you say that, yet at the same time, reach out with a willingness to compromise and engage beyond just being powerful, I sort of feel like that's what's missing in the diaspora conversation here. And as I see it, and it's not unique to the left and it's not unique to the right, it's both. Today, one almost feels like you need to pick a side and you need to buy in to that side's entire narrative. And if that's on the left, settlements, evil, bad, cause of the conflict, and if you're on the right, we have, a sort of unqualified entitlement and right to everything, and that's realistic. And we sort of our narrative is totally pure. And so what's missing, particularly on the left, I should say, but it's on the right as well, but particularly on the left, is there are very few people that can say those sentences without being ostracized, because a statement to the effect of taking pride in Jews living in Hebron or Kiryat Arba it's not an acceptable sort of viewpoint anymore within those communities. So how do we, in the diaspora, how do we take the opportunity to sort of engage with the next generation, younger generation, people in their university students, all the way to people in their 40s, 50s, whatever? I suppose it's not really limited by age, but how do we restart that conversation so people come out of their sort of boxes and corners and can say those, I think, brave statements and feel them, yet still, if it's from the left, find a way to match their liberal worldview with the Jewish story and where we sit today?
Well, Jeremy, there are two things that I want to come back to that you said earlier. One is the need for empathy among Jews. And before we begin the process of empathy for the other, we need to internalize empathy for our fellow Jews. And the other thing you mentioned was that I come from the right, and that remains very deeply in me, and that's always going to be in me. And even though I position myself today very firmly in the center of the Israeli political map, the center is that meeting point between left and right. There are elements that I contain within my centrist being that are indistinguishable from the settlers. My starting point is that it's all mine, from the river to the sea. To quote a Palestinian slogan, from the river to the sea, it's all mine. Or to quote the Mishnah, Kula Shali, it all belongs to me. But the left-wing side of me says, not so fast. There's another people between the river and the sea. What are we going to do with that other people? How will we square our identity as a Jewish and democratic state with a permanent occupation of another people? Now, the way that I use the word occupation, by the way, is very much in a centrist way. I don't believe that I am an occupier of any part of the land of Israel, but I am occupying another people that's here. And so I have to try at least to come to terms with the presence of that other people, try to implement the only solution that was ever on the table, going back to 1937, really to the origins of this conflict. That was partition. And the majority of the Zionist movement always accepted partition. It includes, by the way, the religious Zionist movement. The religious Zionist movement supported partition in 1937 and 1947. It changed after the Six-Day War.
Yeah.
But so being a centrist for me is more than a political position. It is, I would even call it a spiritual position. It's that place of empathy for my fellow Jews. It's where I try to listen to the contradictory voices of left and right and try to make sense of them. And that, for me, I should say, was really essential to my aliyah. I moved to Israel in the summer of 1982, at the beginning of the Lebanon War, which was the precise moment where the left-right schism opened up into an abyss. That was the moment when war no longer united Israelis, but tore us apart. Now, thank God that was a one-off. Thank God it never happened before or since. But my experience of becoming an Israeli was falling into the left-right abyss. And so my response as a new immigrant was, I'm going to pay careful attention to the left and the right before I join the cacophony. I'm going to listen and try to understand. And the result was, I would listen to the left, and they would say, how can we possibly remain a Jewish and democratic state and maintain a forcible occupation in the long term? And I said, makes sense to me. And I would listen to the right, and they'd say, well, how can we possibly make peace with a Palestinian national movement that doesn't accept our most basic legitimacy? Makes sense to me. And I realized very early on that left and right were not arguing out there in two rival camps. They were arguing inside of me, tearing me apart. And I became a centrist. And I carry those two voices in me all the time. And when the book came out in the US, there were some Jews, especially on the left, who were very confused. They said, well, this is a book about peace, but it doesn't sound left-wing, Like, where is this guy coming from? He's not really one of us. And my response was, I'm actually not one of you. I'm not on the left, but I have elements of the left very deeply in me, as I have elements of the right deeply in me. And the only way that I feel we're going to be able to be effective as a people in dealing with this deeply wrenching challenge of the Palestinians and of our place generally in the Middle East is if we manage to combine the insights, wisdom of the left-wing part of us and the right-wing part of us.
It's quite fascinating, really. And in a sense, it's a little bit depressing. And I'll tell you why I find it a bit depressing, because I think when I reflect on all of this, I feel like you had, we talked about your upbringing, right? And it was intense. But you also had either access to, or if it was in the home or the community, you were educated. Okay, if it was from your days in Beitar or with Mir Khan or whoever it was, you were educated. And I think in order to engage in that sort of, if you call it centrist, or to engage with the left and the right and understand, you need to have that base level of Jewish, you need to be Jewishly literate. And the challenge that I see, and why I find it depressing in the diaspora today, is that many, many, many of the young people who are the subject of these never-ending discussions and debates, how do we engage them, and young people drifting away from Israel. The biggest challenge that I see is that many of these people, I'm going to call them kids, they're adults, don't have basic Jewish literacy. And so it's very hard for them to feel the pain in terms of an understanding. You need to have an understanding of Jewish history to know what giving up Hebron or a Jewish presence in Hebron means, even if you're prepared to give it up for the reasons that you've just described. You can't teach someone cannot feel that emotion if they don't understand the Jewish story and Jewish history. And so, the situation's slightly different in Australia, where we have a very high level of participation in the Jewish day school system. We have 50% of Jewish kids in the day school system, and that helps. And we have a strong, youth culture and student body. But still, what do you think the future is of particularly American Jewry and Israel? And I don't know if I'm sure you have actually, but your colleague, I think, because you're both at Shalom, Danny Gordis, wrote what I thought was a really fascinating book recently on the divide between diaspora Jewry, US Jewry in Israel. We stand divided. And he sort of explores some of the underlying drivers. But what do you see as the future of, let's limit it to the US, because I think Australia is different and the US, but US Jewry and Israel. Is this only going to deteriorate further, or do you see green shoots?
It partly depends on what happens in Israel and what happens in America. The last decade of the American Jewish-Israeli relationship has been severely complicated by two American non-Jews, Obama and Trump. Obama was wildly popular among American Jews and widely detested among Israelis, especially because of his, what I would call, a policy of appeasement in Iran. Trump is widely appreciated among Israelis and widely detested and feared, I would say rightly so, American Jews. It's something that many Israelis don't understand what a deep threat Trump really is to what makes America, what has made America unique, which is this culture of political decency, which is almost completely gone. So I don't see Trump as a threat to American Jewry directly, but I see Trump as a threat to what has made American Jewry thrive, which is an open and accepting society. America is closing in on itself. And I am far more concerned today about the political culture in America than, for example, in Israel. I think Israeli society, for all our schisms, is far more capable of finding common ground than America is today. And this impacts the American Jewish-Israeli relationship. And so on our side, it also depends on how far we're going to go. For example, with annexation. Are we going to annex parts of Judea and Samaria in the next few months? If we do, that will have a disastrous impact on the American Jewish-Israeli relationship, to say nothing of our relationships here in the region. And so looking at the relationship more broadly, 90% of world Jewry now lives either in Israel or in America. It's an extraordinary moment. After 200 years of Jewish migration, uprooting, the Jewish people has more or less settled into these two places, with a few significant satellite communities around the world. But basically, the Jewish people of the 21st century is going to be, as it already is, defined not only by these two communities, but increasingly by the relationship between these two communities. And so when we talk about the future of the Jewish people, much of that future is going to be defined by whether these two very different communities are going to be able to find some common ground. Now, we in Israel are defined because of our geography, because of our history. We are tribal, we are particularistic. That's the core of our Jewish identity. For American Jews, because of their geography, they are defined by much more universal commitments. Now, the universal particular tension within Jewish identity goes back for centuries, if not millennia. It is embedded in our being. It goes back, to my mind, it goes back to Avraham Avinu, to Abraham. When God tells Abraham, Lech Lecha, leave your father's home, leave your non-Jewish environment. So that is God separating Avraham and forming a particularist people. But then a few verses later, God explains to Abraham why he's being separated from the nations. Through your progeny, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So a Jewish people is being created, a particularist people is being separated and created for the sake of a universal goal. And so built into our identity is a particularist universalist thing. The danger of Jewish life today is that American Jewry is taking the universal goal of the Abrahamic blessing to an extreme, to the exclusion of the particularist commitment. And in Israel, we're losing sight of the universal meaning of Jewish history. We exist not only for ourselves, and that's none of us saying that, that's God telling Abraham. And so we need to figure out ways of balancing our particularist loyalties and needs with the universal vision. That's the challenge of the American Jewish-Israeli relationship. And I think that that's the issue that we need to put front and center in our dialogue.
Interesting. We could talk about that alone for a couple of hours, I think. Yossi, you mentioned annexation, and maybe this is an opportunity to briefly talk about annexation, but not through the usual sort of left-right prism. And I suppose annexation really draws out these key themes that, for you, I imagine, and for me, that we've been speaking about. On the one hand, we're talking about parts of, the historic land of Israel that, that we, many Jews believe that we have even forget a biblical right, but a right to as a people. Yet on the other hand, there are other people living in those areas, and there is a question around, does annexation, even if many, if not the vast majority of Israelis recognize today that we don't have a partner for peace and that we are not going to be able to negotiate some sort of peace arrangement in the foreseeable future. But the question for them is, does this act, even if one can justify it as a standalone sort of in a moral sense, does that then prevent or somehow make it impossible to reach a resolution in the future? And then by supporting annexation, even if you can think of many reasons in a Jewish historical sense why it is important, what are you then in effect giving up on a Jewish democratic Jewish state that lives at peace with its neighbors in the future if you accept annexation? How do you view it?
So my starting point is that, of course, we have the right to all of this land. The next question that I ask myself is it wise to exercise that right? Do we in our personal lives insist on exercising every theoretical right that we have? We always filter or balance the theoretical right with practical consequences. For me, the practical consequences of annexation are frightening, devastating. My understanding of one of the crucial sources of Jewish power in the post-Holocaust era is, first of all, maintaining the basic unity of the Jewish people. That is the prerequisite for Jewish power. To take a step that will alienate, perhaps even risk permanently alienating, large parts of the diaspora, certainly in America, is, to my mind, close to suicidal. The second foundation of post-Holocaust Jewish power, and it's related to the first, is maintaining the moral credibility of our power. The one war that Israel lost was the war into which I made Aliyah, which was the 1982 war. And we lost that war because we forfeited the moral high ground. It's the only war where many Israelis didn't believe that we had the moral high ground. I remember terrible scenes of Israeli reservists coming back from the front in Beirut, returning their equipment when their tour of duty ended, and going as a unit to demonstrate at the Prime Minister's office. We'd never experienced anything like that. Annexation, to my mind, is a self-inflicted wound, first of all, in terms of our ability to maintain Jewish unity, and secondly, the moral upper hand. And finally, this is coming at a time when parts of the Arab world are beginning to open up to the permanence and even cautiously the legitimacy of Israel. We're hearing voices in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, other parts of the Arab world we haven't seen before. I'll give you an example. My book was reviewed favorably in the Saudi media. Yeah. I mean, we've never seen anything like that before. A book about Zionism getting a 2-page review in Saudi Arabia's leading news magazine. There have been bloggers around the Arab world who've responded positively to the book. And we know something is changing in the region, if only because the Arab world is terrified of Iran and is looking toward Israel for some kind of a security alliance. Now, this is a moment. This is a precious moment. There is a group that I've been involved with called the Arab Council for Regional Integration, a group of several dozen prominent Arab public figures around the Middle East who came together to lobby for normalization with Israel. We've never had anything like this before. An Arab organization trying to counter the legitimization of Israel. Is this really the moment to take such a provocative step? Yes, we have the right. This is the moment to exercise the right. Should that right be exercised at all? These are the questions we need to grapple.
And do you think, no one has a crystal ball, but do you think that Prime Minister Netanyahu wants this issue on his plate at the moment? Is this something he wants to deal with?
I would have once unequivocally said that Netanyahu would sooner reach a deal with the Palestinians than an X. That was the Netanyahu of the Bar Ilan speech in 2010. The Netanyahu who wrote in his book of of the 1990s, a place among the nations, that it isn't only the Israeli left that is capable of wishful thinking, but also the settler right, and who really represented the tough, no-nonsense position of the center. And I was a former Netanyahu voter, and I felt that Netanyahu really represented that position of a majority of Israelis who don't trust the other side, but also know that it will be in our interests to find a partner for a negotiated agreement, if that were possible. And Netanyahu all along seemed to be that leader. Something has gone wrong in the last few years, and we all know what it is. It's Netanyahu's legal problems, which forced him to turn to the right, to the hard right. Netanyahu, over the last year, did the unthinkable and created a tacit alliance with the disciples of Meir Kahane. It was the Likud that voted to ban Kach, the Kahanists, from the Knesset. Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir led a walkout in the Knesset when Meir Kahane got up to speak in 1984. We forget this. When did the normative democratic right become co-opted by the radical anti-democratic right? That is a tragedy for the Israeli political system. And I put the blame squarely with Netanyahu, and I don't believe that he has had an ideological change of heart. I think this is cynical. Yeah. And for all of the tremendous good that Netanyahu did in keeping Israel safe through the most turbulent years in the history of the Middle East, modern Middle East, keeping us prosperous, for now just recently with Corona, keeping us relatively safe. For all of the good that we owe Netanyahu, how do you do this? How do you destroy the right as a credible democratic force? And how do you play future of Israel by opening the way to steps on the ground that will be irreversible?
So we've got some questions from the audience before we wrap up, which I'd like to put to you. The first is, a few people have spotted your collection and also followed you on some of your posts on Facebook about music. And the question is, how has music influenced your work? And do you think it can be used as a tool to sort of bring, the two sides together?
It has influenced my work in ways that I'm not even conscious of. And it is one of the great underutilized tools for bringing diaspora Jews and Israelis closer together. Especially Israeli music in its most recent iteration. I would say since the Second Intifada, we've seen something extraordinary happening in Israeli music. And by the way, Jeremy, I'm so grateful for this question. This is what I really care about, is Israeli music. And what you see behind you are hundreds of CDs, and it's all Israeli music. And this, for me, is the Israel that I live in, is this music. And since the Second Intifada, Israeli music took a sharp cultural turn away from the old model of the Hebrew secular Zionist music, which was the carrier of the secularization of Israeli culture, to a new turn of now being the carrier of the re-Judaization of Israeli culture. Israeli music today is so deeply Jewish and even religious. You have prayer coming through rock music, an extraordinary meeting point of piyut, the prayer poems of the diaspora, especially the Jews of Arab countries, with the most avant-garde Israeli music. And something extraordinarily rich is happening here that isn't only Israeli, but is deeply Jewish and belongs, I feel, to the whole Jewish people. And what I try to do in my limited way on my Facebook page, and you're all really welcome, invited to join, is to showcase the vitality of Israelis.
Beautiful. Well, Yossi, I think we might have time just for one of the last questions that came through. We're not going to be able to get to everyone's questions, I'm sorry. But you touched on this a minute ago when you talked about sort of the damage that you felt to the right, to the legitimacy of the right, that some of the things that recent Israeli governments have done. And I think one of the manifestations of that has been in the lead up to the recent elections, the sort of scare campaign in relation to Gantz potentially forming a coalition with the United Arab List. And again, so much of the way you approach issues in your book has sort of given me a tool to articulate how I see these things, because I see it on the one hand, I see some of the rhetoric as being, if not bordering on racist, outwardly racist. And yet on the other hand, I absolutely understand and feel the anxiety of many Israelis of forming a coalition with a party that is made up of many individuals who have said terrible things, endorsed terrorism, and fundamentally are opposed to Israel as a Jewish state. How have you sort of seen that play out?
So I make a distinction between the Arab list, which is pretty much what the Israeli right says it is, and Arab voters. Now, I don't absolve Arab voters for electing the list to represent them. There's a very problematic dynamic at work here. Nevertheless, when you look at the polls, especially recent, especially since Corona, it's an extraordinary poll that just came out. 77% of Arab Israelis say that they see their future entwined with the future and well-being of the state of Israel. A majority of Arab Israelis say they are proud to be Israeli citizens. Well, that's extraordinary.
Yeah.
And the irony here is, I'm sure that if you were to ask the Arab Knesset members the same question, most of them would say, no, we're certainly not proud. In fact, I have, as a former journalist, I once asked an Arab Knesset member, I said, what was your most Israeli moment? And he looked at me and he says, I have never had an Israeli moment. I'm thinking, this guy is sitting in the Knesset. He represents the state of Israel. So there's a very complicated dynamic at work here that we need to address. So I understand the criticism of Gantz from the right about forming an alliance even tacitly with the Arab list. I understand that, even though I think that it was an important moment for Gantz to test the possibilities, see whether there was a chance of softening in the Arab-Jewish relationship. But where I deeply fault the right is when Netanyahu said after the most recent election that he actually, or his right-wing bloc, won the election because they won a majority of Jewish votes. Now, as far I was under the misconception that we were holding Israeli elections and not Jewish elections. Israeli elections means that anyone with an Israeli passport has the right to vote. Now, Gantz's bloc won the majority of Israeli votes. Did they not win the election because they didn't win the majority of Jewish votes? Netanyahu raised an issue that was too quickly forgotten. And that was the first time in the history of the state of Israel when a prime minister tore open the delicate fabric that connects the Jewish and democratic identities of this country. These are the two non-negotiable foundations of Israeli identity. Anyone who challenges either the Jewishness of Israel or the democratic nature of Israel is doing fundamental violence to Israel. We have a responsibility, all of us who love Israel, to protect Israel as a Jewish state and as a democratic.
Well, Yossi, thank you very much. I could do this for hours very happily, and I'm holding you to your willingness to come to Australia when things return to some sort of new normal. But thank you very much. I would
Thank you.
Really encourage, and one thing that I didn't mention, there's actually a third audience for your book, and we didn't talk about it. We talked about the Palestinian audience, we talked about diaspora Jewry, but the other audience is actually non-Jewish political leadership, particularly on the left, outside of Australia, not Jewish. And I've used this, I've given this book to several Australian politicians, and I gave it to them, and I said to them, this is, if you want to understand the Israeli psyche, read this book, because this explains where we are coming from holistically. And so I think you've got multiple audiences there, and I'd encourage anyone that hasn't to read it, to buy it. We'll put a link on this Facebook stream. And Yossi, we look forward to continuing the conversation. I'll just hand it over to Bren to wrap up.
I mean, it's such a pleasure to speak with you, and thank you for all you do.
Yossi, Jeremy, thank you so much. That was a fantastic conversation. As we promised, it spoke about identity, it spoke about diaspora-Israel relations, and of course, the Israeli-Palestinian relations. Yossi had powerful words there about annexation and about Netanyahu, which I think will have a lot of people talking and thinking for the next couple of hours, the next couple of days. And feel free to continue the conversation through the Facebook comments. Look, it really is a truly readable book. I actually got it for my mother, whose birthday was a couple of weeks ago. It's Mother's Day today. If you've forgotten to buy your mum a present, you've still got a couple of hours to order it for her. She'll thank you. She'll give it to her friends. It's a great book. Look, thank you everyone for joining us. As I said, next week we have Iman and Masha, the Israeli embassy spokesperson. She will make for a fantastic conversation as well. So we will see you next week. In the meantime, stay healthy and have a good week. Goodbye.
Thank you.